Now to the diplomatic standoff between the United States and Iran over Tehran's nuclear program. Despite Washington's massive military buildup in the Middle East, Iran's foreign minister said there was, quote, a good chance to have a diplomatic solution. Talks with U.S. negotiators are set to resume on Thursday. This comes as the clerical regime in Tehran is under increased pressure at home, with students staging a second day of anti-government demonstrations.
Footage posted online shows pro- and anti-government protesters clashing in Tehran at a rally held as a tribute to the thousands killed in mass demonstrations last month. It's the first major show of defiance since the crackdown. Meanwhile, the threat of U.S. intervention is ever present. Washington has assembled a large military force within striking distance of Iran. On Saturday, White House envoy Steve Witkoff told Fox News that President Donald Trump is losing patience with the Iranian government.
I don't want to use the word frustrated. It's almost because he understands he's got plenty of alternatives. But it's curious. He's curious as to why they haven't, I don't want to use the word capitulated, but why they haven't capitulated. Why under this sort of pressure with the amount of sea power, naval power that we have over there, why they haven't come to us and said, we profess that we don't want a weapon, so here's what we're prepared to do, and yet it's hard to sort of get them to that place.
Iran has long maintained it is not seeking to build nuclear weapons, but has rejected specific measures demanded by the U.S., such as zero uranium enrichment. Still, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi showed signs of hope ahead of the next round of talks with the U.S.
If they want to find a resolution for Iran's peaceful nuclear program, the only way is diplomacy. And we have proved this in the past, and I believe that still there is a good chance to have a diplomatic solution which is based on a win-win game, and a solution is at our reach. So there is no need for any military build-up, and military build-up cannot help it and cannot pressurize us.
At the same time, the Iranian official warned his country is prepared to strike back if America attacks.
Let's take a closer look at this now with Middle East expert René Wildangel. René, Iranians are back on the streets despite thousands being killed in previous protests. What does that tell us about the regime's grip on society?
Well, I mean, what we're seeing now is the protests taking up on the university campuses. This is the beginning of the university semester in Iran. And it's also the 40-day mourning period after so many protesters had been killed in early January, among them many of those students. So it's a sign of defiance. It's a sign that Iranians are not stopping this protest because the structural situation, of course, is the same. They are frustrated with the economic situation, with the corruption in the regime, and now also with this enormous brutality that they have experienced. So I think it's a question of time that protests will take up again despite this brutality. And the grip on society, I think, has never really been very closely. There were always lots of spaces within Iranian society for protests on the human rights situation, on press freedom, but the repression that we've seen has grown from the Green Wave protests to 2009 to the Women Life Freedom protests to the most recent protests. The answer of the Iranian regime got more and more brutal.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is putting pressure on Iran. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is surprised that Iran hasn't already capitulated in negotiations with the U.S., or at least moved toward concessions. How is the Iranian regime able to survive in the face of these huge pressures, both from at home and abroad?
Well, that's one of the big questions, Marks. How long are they gonna survive? First and foremost, the domestic pressure, I think, and then secondly, the build-up by the US that we currently see in the region. We've just heard this soundbite by the chief negotiator Witkoff, and I think it's very telling that he talks about capitulation. I mean, he says, I don't want to use the word capitulation, but then he says it. And if you start negotiations with the expectations that the other side will capitulate, it's not very likely that negotiations will lead to anything. But then also, I think the end game of the U.S. Strategy here is very unclear, because on the one hand, we talk about the nuclear program, as we've talked about it for decades, and I think maybe a solution within the nuclear program would be possible. But then the U.S. also has talked about the allies of Iran in the region. It has talked about the ballistic missile program that it wants to see basically gone. And President Trump has talked about regime change. So the end game here is unclear. And what do you expect of the Iranian regime? Maybe you can come to an agreement in the nuclear file. But if you expect that this regime is going to give up, capitulate, and agree to the expectation of regime change, that is not very realistic. And I think this is also the reason why we must expect a military confrontation here.
René, thank you very much for your assessment. That was Middle East expert René Wildangel.
Thank you.
Well, for more on this, we can speak now with Siavush Randjbar Daemi. He's senior lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of St. Andrews. Thanks for being with us. First of all, what do you make of the new protests in Iran?
Well, they're quite interesting because they flared up as universities opened for the new semester. So a new public space came into being. And it is clear that student anger with regards to the repression in January hasn't gone away at all in the past month or so. What is also interesting is that we start to see slogans different from the ones we saw in the streets. Some of those slogans were in favor of Reza Pahlavi, of a monarchical restoration. We saw part of that in some campuses in Tehran as well yesterday. But we also saw slogans, again, in favor of the women life freedom movement, for the establishment of an Iranian republic rather than an Islamic one, against any form of tyranny, against any form of, in favor of democracy and equality. So clearly the student communities across the country, actually, it's spread across various universities, and protests are apparently continuing today as well, is angry, is frustrated, is committed to carrying on the struggle against not only the authorities, but also in part against the monarchy. But there's also part of the student body that has come up again with monarchical slogans. So the situation looks very lively in the universities.
So you talked about the commitment of these students going out onto the streets. Do you think the current protests then are likely to continue, given what happened last month with thousands of demonstrators being killed?
Well, even despite the protests last month, they've been going on for 2 days now. Protests are planned today as well in various campuses, including the main ones in Tehran. So if this momentum keeps going, they might spill into other parts of society. Clearly, the strategy of using brute force to clear the streets by the authorities hasn't reduced or eliminated the resentment, the anger, or the structural reasons, of course, which led to the protests starting in the first place. And university students were involved there as well. But this time, with the opening of semesters, there's actually a critical mass of students gathering on campus. And the authorities so far have not sent security forces into campuses. They've used pro-regime student bodies to confront the students. Today, apparently, classes are taking place in person rather than being shifted online due to security concerns.
Well, as these demonstrations are happening on campuses in Iran, the U.S. is building up its military forces in the region. Washington, it seems to want to keep its strike options open. What message is this sending to the people inside Iran?
Well, some people inside Iran are in favor of foreign intervention. Others are very strongly opposed. As many other things, even this is a very polarizing issue within Iranian society at the moment. People are still recovering from the trauma. They're holding 40-day ceremonies for the dead. The memory of the Israeli strikes is still fresh from June last year. So it is hard to gauge what the prevailing mood is, but there will be certainly a diversity of views regarding this. And there's a lot of panic. People are stockpiling food, and there is obviously a lot of panic because it is clear that an American offensive will be as virulent, if not more, than the Israeli one in June.
Siavush, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Siavush Randjbar Daemi of the University of St. Andrews.
Thank you.